quiet afternoon outside a city school turns unforgettable when a young black girl walks up to a billionaire and softly asks, "Can I go along with you?" He wasn't there to make connections, just to check a building site and leave. But her eyes held something he couldn't walk away from, a reflection of his own forgotten past. What begins as a simple car ride becomes a journey into memory, responsibility, and the kind of broken hope most people never notice. As their lives intertwine, the question lingers in the air. What do we owe to the people we once were, and the promises we never meant to keep? Natalie didn't flinch when he looked up at her. Her voice had come out steady, too steady for a child. "Can I go along with you?" she repeated, eyes locked on his, like she'd already decided the answer would be yes. Nathaniel Walker blinked. At first he thought maybe she was asking someone behind him, but no. There she stood, skinny arms poking from the sleeves of a too-big denim jacket, the fraying straps of a faded pink backpack looped tightly around her shoulders. Her hair was pulled into uneven puffs, one sagging to the side like it had given up for the day. She didn't look afraid. She didn't even look hopeful. She looked tired, like someone who'd waited long enough. He lowered his phone slowly. "I'm sorry, what?" She didn't move. "I asked if I can go along with you." Nate's gaze drifted past her to the nearly empty sidewalk. Southwood Elementary had cleared out an hour ago. The metal gate creaked as the last teacher pulled it shut behind her, vanishing down the street. A few leaves skittered across the pavement, but the girl didn't shiver. Her sneakers, if you could call them that, were more duct tape than shoe. One lace knotted 3 times like it had been giving her trouble all day. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Where are your parents?" She shifted her backpack, one hand gripping the strap a little tighter. "My mom's gone, my dad. He's not coming." That was the first time Nate felt it, that sharp edge of familiarity, like her words had reached backward and touched a version of him he didn't talk about anymore. He caught himself and looked away. "You shouldn't be talking to strangers," he said, forcing some distance into his voice. "But you're not a stranger," she replied. "You were in the papers last week. You built the new shelter on First and Grant." Nate blinked again. "You read the paper?" "No," she said simply. "Miss Elaine reads us the headlines. Said you were important." He scoffed, just under his breath, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "That doesn't mean I take kids home." "I don't need a home," she said. "I just need a ride." Behind him, Sam stepped out of the car. His driver of 17 years didn't say anything at first, but the way he looked at Nate spoke louder than words. It was the kind of look Sam gave before telling him he was being stupid. She's not panicking," Nate muttered. "That's concerning." "She's alone," Sam said. "And she asked you, not me. That means something." Nate stared down at her again. Her jacket sleeve had slipped past her wrist, and she was adjusting it quietly, like she'd already accepted that he might walk away. Most kids her age would be crying, or running, or demanding. Not her. She stood there like she'd already been through worse. "What's your name?" he asked. "Natalie." "Natalie what?" "Brooks." The name didn't ring any bells, but something about it sat uneasily in his chest. Sam cleared his throat. "You remember how long you sat on those steps at Union Baptist?" Nate didn't answer. "You remember who passed you by?" Still no answer. "You remember the one who didn't." "That did it." He sighed, ran a hand down his face, and finally jerked his chin toward the car. "Come on then. But if this turns out to be something I have to explain to Child Services, I'm sending them your way." Natalie nodded and followed him without a word. She climbed into the back seat of the black Lincoln without hesitation, buckling herself in like she'd done it 100 times. Nate got in beside her and glanced at Sam through the mirror. "Just drive," he said. "Where to, Natalie?" 28 Garden Hollow, she answered. "Near Morning Star Chapel. My grandma's there." He tilted his head slightly. "And what about your dad?" "He's not," she said. And that was the end of that. The car pulled away from the curb, its engine a soft hum as they slipped into late afternoon traffic. Natalie leaned her head against the window, her breath fogging a small circle in the glass. She pulled a crumpled comic book from her backpack. X-Men, old and bent, pages dog-eared from love more than carelessness, and flipped to the middle. She didn't read aloud. She didn't hum or fidget. She just sat there, mouthing the words silently, as if escaping into a different world where mutants saved the day. Nate watched her in the rearview mirror. "You're not scared?" he asked finally. She didn't look up. Bad people don't usually drive nice cars. He felt a twinge in his chest again. "That's not always true." She shrugged. "I looked you in the eyes. Bad people don't let you do that either." Sam chuckled under his breath, then caught himself. They rode in silence after that, the buildings around them turning more worn, the sidewalks narrower. A few people lingered on stoops, eyeing the black car like it didn't belong. Nate couldn't blame them. This wasn't a part of the city where men like him were seen, unless it was campaign season or something needed tearing down. As they neared the address, Natalie sat up straighter. "That's it," she pointed. "The house with the yellow curtain." The place was smaller than Nate expected. Weathered siding, a porch that leaned too hard to one side, a curtain, yes, pale yellow and fluttering from a cracked window. A coat hung there, too, like it had been left out to dry days ago and forgotten. The car hadn't stopped yet, but Natalie was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "Wait." "Don't." Nate started, but she was out the door before he could finish. She ran up the sidewalk, backpack bouncing. An elderly woman sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket so thin it looked more like a scarf. She was coughing into her hand, the sound sharp and rattling. "Grandma," Natalie called. The woman looked up and opened her arms just in time for Natalie to crash into them. Nate stepped out of the car, unsure why, but his feet moved anyway. "That's the man who brought me back," Natalie said quickly. "Daddy didn't show." The woman looked over Natalie's shoulder, her eyes catching on Nate's face, and holding, her brow furrowed. "You," she rasped. You're the one." "I'm sorry." "In the picture," she whispered. "On the wall." Nate blinked. She pointed weakly toward the door. "Inside, by the fireplace." He stepped closer. The smell of old fabric, lavender, and something faintly medicinal drifted out of the house. He hesitated, then ducked into the tiny living room. There, above a peeling mantelpiece, hung a sun-bleached photograph in a cheap frame. A younger version of himself knelt beside a boy, tying a loose shoelace. He stared. That boy was familiar. Big eyes, the same half-smile Natalie wore when she wasn't trying. "My son," the old woman said softly from behind him. "Natalie's father. He said you were the only man who ever looked him in the eye. You told him he mattered, and then you disappeared." Nate's breath caught. The walls felt smaller suddenly. "Held Natalie all about you," the woman continued. "Said if anything ever happened, look for the men who helped him believe." Nate turned to find Natalie standing in the doorway now, comic book tucked under one arm, eyes wide but calm. "You need new shoes," he said, because his voice couldn't find anything else to say. She shook her head. "I need someone who doesn't lead." The words hung there, heavier than they had any right to be. He had no answer. Not yet. But he didn't leave. Not that night. Sam didn't say anything for the first 10 minutes of the drive. He kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel like always. Nate sat in the back seat this time, leaning against the window, watching the city slip past them like it had somewhere better to be. Natalie sat beside him again, same quiet posture, same tired backpack resting in her lap. They'd left Garden Hollow just as the porch light flickered on behind them, casting a faint glow on the warped wood and loose shingles of the roof. Grace Brooks, her voice hoarse but her eyes sharp, had thanked Nate with a kind of finality that didn't sit right with him. She hadn't asked for favors or charity, just said, "Thank you for bringing her back," and gone inside, like she didn't expect to see him again, like she'd already said goodbye. Now Natalie was tracing the lines of her comic book with one finger, eyes down, her lips moving slightly with a dialogue she knew by heart. Nate didn't know why he hadn't gone straight home, or told Sam to drive to the office, or just dropped the girl off and left it at that. But here he was, still in the car, still watching her. "You always carry that thing around?" he asked finally, nodding to the comic book. She nodded without looking up. "It was my mom's. She used to read it to me when I was little, before bed." He didn't ask about her mother. He already knew too much. Natalie flipped a page. She said Storm was the strongest. Not because she could fly or control weather or anything, but because she stayed calm, even when things were falling apart. "That's a good lesson," Nate said quietly. Sam glanced at them in the mirror. "You okay back there?" Nate shifted. "Yeah, just keep driving for a bit." "To where?" He paused. "Take the long way back to the west side." Sam gave the slightest nod and turned onto Lincoln Avenue, away from the skyline and deeper into the neighborhoods Nate had once called home, if you could call it that. Natalie finally looked up. "You used to live here." Nate blinked. "What makes you say that? You know where to go without checking your phone? Most people get lost around here." He didn't answer. Just watch the blocks go by. Row houses with chipped paint and rusted gates, playgrounds with more glass than grass, old laundromats and bodegas with handwritten signs taped to the windows. The same streets he'd walked when his shoes didn't fit, when dinner was sometimes a church sandwich or nothing at all. He hadn't been back in years. Not since the last groundbreaking ceremony for a redevelopment project that never quite got funded. "You see that place?" he pointed as they passed a brick building with blacked-out windows and an old sign hanging crooked from a nail. "That used to be a community center. What happened to it?" "Same thing that happens to everything around here," Sam muttered from the front. "People stop showing up, then the money stops, then the lights go out." "Why'd you leave?" Natalie asked. He didn't respond right away. "Because someone told me I didn't have to stay." "Who?" "A woman named Miss Arlene. She ran the orphanage I was in. She made us feel like we weren't just mistakes waiting to grow up." Natalie nodded like she understood, even if she didn't. They drove a few more blocks in silence before she asked, "You have kids?" Nate shook his head. "No." "Me not." He hesitated. "Never really thought I'd be good at it." "Seems like you're trying," she said, without looking at him. He looked out the window again, unsure how to feel about that. They stopped at a light. Across the street, a group of kids were playing under a busted street lamp. A basketball bounced unevenly across cracked concrete. One of them called out to another. Laughter followed, quick and loud. Nate stared at them for a moment too long. "Do you ever think about coming back?" Natalie asked softly. "To live?" He scoffed. "This city doesn't need more people like me." "Am I not?" "Because I left." She blinked at him like she didn't understand. Or maybe she just didn't agree. "You could fix things," she said simply. "Money doesn't fix everything," he replied. "I didn't say money," she said. "I said you." That silenced him. It echoed in the quiet cabin of the car like a truth no one had dared speak before. A moment later, Sam turned the corner and slowed the car. "Want to stop here?" he asked. Nate looked up. They were parked in front of St. Jude's, once a shelter, now boarded up. The sign was still there, cracked but readable. He'd stayed there for a month when he was 13, between one failed foster home and the next. He opened the door and stepped out without answering. Natalie followed, hugging her comic to her chest. The building smelled of mold and old paper. Broken glass crunched underfoot. Graffiti stretched across the side wall. Mostly tags, but one mural caught his eye. A little black boy reaching for the sky, fingers almost touching a star, painted just out of reach. Natalie looked up at him. "You think that's supposed to be you?" He didn't answer. They stood there together, side by side, both of them looking at that star. Wind rustled the trees nearby, and somewhere a train howled in the distance. "I used to sleep by that radiator," Nate said after a long silence, pointing to a corner inside. "Every night I'd pray it wouldn't snow. I hated snow. Meant I'd wake up cold, even with my coat on." Natalie didn't say anything. She just stood beside him, listening. "I used to draw," he added suddenly. "Not good or anything, just stuff. I'd draw new buildings, places that didn't leak, places where the windows closed all the way." "You should build those," she said. He turned to her. "You think that's what I do now? I think you forgot why you started." His breath caught again, same as earlier. It was like she kept reaching into some part of him he thought he'd locked up long ago, and finding the softest spot. They walked back to the car. Sam didn't ask questions. He just pulled away from the curb and turned back toward the city's west end. Natalie leaned against the window again, head tilted slightly as her eyes drifted closed. "You hungry?" Nate asked suddenly. She didn't open her eyes. "A little." He looked at Sam. "Find somewhere good. Somewhere that doesn't have cloth napkins or valet service." Sam smirked. "Thought you'd never ask." They stopped at a small diner tucked between a corner store and a laundromat. Plastic booths, sticky menus, smell of grease and syrup in the air. A place where nobody looked twice at a man in a $1,000 coat sitting next to a little girl in duct-taped shoes. They ate in silence at first. Pancakes for her, coffee and eggs for him. She tore her pancakes with her hands, dipping each piece into syrup like it was a routine she'd perfected. "You're not afraid of me?" he asked. Natalie looked up. "Why would I be? Because people like me don't usually stop." She shrugged. "You did." The door jingled as a new customer walked in. The booth light flickered slightly overhead. "Hey, Mike, do you really come up to me?" Nate asked. Natalie stared down at her plate. "Because I remembered what my dad said." "About me?" She nodded. He said, "If you're ever in trouble, look for the man who didn't talk down to me. The one who said I mattered." Nate swallowed hard. "That's what you told him, right?" I think so." "A long time ago?" She picked up another piece of pancake. "He believed you." "For a little while." He looked away, out the window, past the flickering neon sign and the cracked sidewalks. The city hadn't changed much, but maybe he had. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She didn't ask why. She just said, "Okay." The next morning, Nate stood outside the office conference room, hand hovering near the door handle. He had an 8:00 a.m. call with investors waiting inside, a slideshow on zoning permits queued up, and a stack of quarterly reports prepared on the tablet under his arm. But his mind wasn't in there. Not really. He hadn't slept well. Natalie's voice from the night before kept repeating in his head like a scratched record. "He believed you." For a little while, Nate hadn't told anyone about the diner, about the shoelaces, about how she'd sat there across from him in that cracked vinyl booth like she'd done it 100 times, like she wasn't 9 and shouldn't have to ask strangers for help. He pushed the door open. As expected, the room went still. "Morning," he said, forcing a tone of confidence into his voice as he walked in. The suits nodded, eyes flicking from their tablets to him. Slad, one of the presentation, lit the far wall. Proposed redevelopment plan. Eastward corridor, Phase 2. He barely saw it. 20 minutes into the meeting, he caught himself staring out the window, thumb running unconsciously along the side of his coffee cup. When the VP of Community Relations asked him a question about property lines near an old church, Nate blinked like he'd just landed on Earth. I'll circle back with you on that," he said, voice low. As soon as the meeting ended, he stepped into his office, shut the door behind him, and reached for his phone. Sam picked up on the first ring. "Morning, boss. You at the office already? I need you to pick me up." "Something wrong?" Nate paused. "We're going to Garden Hollow." Sam didn't ask why. He just said, "On my way." 30 minutes later, Nate sat in the back of the Lincoln again, a paper bag resting beside him. Inside it, a pair of new sneakers. Not flashy, not expensive. Just something clean, strong. Something that could take a beating. As they turned the corner, the crooked yellow curtain on the window came into view. The same porch, the same leaning banister, the same sagging roof. But now it felt different. It felt unfinished. Natalie wasn't outside. Nate stepped out and walked slowly to the door. He knocked once, then again. Footsteps shuffled behind it. The door cracked open, and Grace Brooks peered through, her eyes narrow and cautious. "Good morning," Nate said softly. "You came back." He nodded. "Is Natalie here?" Grace hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." The air inside was thick with the scent of lavender, old wood, and heating oil. A space heater hummed quietly in the corner. Nate stepped over a worn rug with frayed edges and found Natalie on the couch, curled under a blanket with her comic book again. She looked up, eyes wide but calm. "You hungry?" he asked, lifting the bag slightly. She didn't answer, but set the comic aside. He pulled out the shoes. "I wasn't sure of your size." Natalie blinked. "These for me? Only if you promise not to use them to run away from school." That made her smile. Barely. Grace sank into the chair across from them, coughing softly into a tissue. Nate looked around. The living room was small. 2 pieces of furniture, a coffee table cluttered with mail, a wall clock that ticked too loud in the silence. But above the mantel still hung the photograph. The one with him and the boy. "Can I ask you something?" Nate said, eyes still on the photo. Grace folded her hands in her lap. "Depends on what it is. The boy in that picture, he's Natalie's father. What happened to him?" She looked down at her knees. "He tried, for a while. Got a job, stayed clean, even went back to church, but then—" Nate waited. Then the system reminded him who it thought he was. He said nothing. A couple years ago, he got picked up for something stupid. Loitering, they said. He got mouthy. They escalated. He never came home the same. Natalie sat quietly, holding the new shoes in her lap like they were made of glass. Grace continued, voice barely above a whisper. He started drifting. Sometimes he'd show up for her birthday, sometimes not. After Jasmine passed, well, he got real good at disappearing. Nate's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry." Grace looked up at him, eyes suddenly sharp. "Don't be sorry. Be useful." That hit harder than it should have. He nodded once, slowly. "I'd like to help. You want to write a check? You can mail it." "I'm not here with money," he said. "I'm here with time." Grace blinked, surprised. "That's so. I don't know what that means yet," Nate admitted. "But I know what it means to wait for someone who never shows up. And I'm tired of remembering what that felt like." Grace watched him, searching his face for something. She must have found it because she stood, slow and shaky, and pointed to the kitchen. "You want to help?" she said. "Start by fixing that leak under the sink. Every time I turn the faucet on, it sounds like the devil's laughing at me." He cracked a smile and rolled up his sleeves. 2 hours later, Nate had not only fixed the leak but also replaced the batteries in the smoke detector, unclogged the bathroom drain, and refastened a curtain rod that had been hanging sideways since Christmas. He was kneeling in front of the sink when he felt Natalie watching him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He looked up. "Because someone should have done it for me." She tilted her head. "You think that makes it better?" "No," he said, "but maybe it makes it different." She nodded slowly, as if she was still deciding how she felt about that answer. Outside, the sky had turned overcast and a soft drizzle tapped the windows. The sound filled the small space with a kind of peace Nate hadn't felt in a long time. Grace was asleep in her chair now, her breathing slow and even. Natalie sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through her comic again, new shoes on her feet, toes wiggling now and then like they were adjusting to the idea of comfort. Sam waited outside, the engine running low. Nate stood and stretched. "I've got to head back," he said quietly. Natalie didn't look up. "You'll come back, right?" she asked. He hesitated. "You want me to?" She shrugged. "You already started the leak list." He chuckled softly. "Then yeah, I'll come back." She nodded, still not looking at him, but he could tell she believed him this time. Or maybe she just wanted to. As he stepped outside, the rain met his face, cold and clean. The porch still leaned, the window still stuck, but something about the house looked sturdier now. Maybe it was just the light. Maybe it was something else. He climbed into the back seat, water soaking his sleeves, but he didn't care. Sam looked at him in the mirror. "You ready to go?" Nate nodded. But this time, he didn't say where. Nate didn't return to the office for 3 days. His assistant left him voicemails. Emails piled up. 2 reporters had requested interviews, and a councilman from the West End sent a gift basket with a note that read, "Let's talk tax incentives." He didn't answer any of it. Instead, he sat at his kitchen counter late at night, the city twinkling beyond his window, flipping an old photograph between his fingers. He hadn't realized Grace still had it, the photo from that day at St. Luke's Rec Center. He had been maybe 17, crouched down on cracked pavement, tying the shoelace of a scrawny boy who couldn't have been more than 6. The boy had dirt on his cheek and a smile that didn't match his eyes. That boy had been Devin Brooks. Nellie's father. Nate barely remembered the moment, only that someone from the nonprofit snapped a picture, praising him for getting involved. He'd been angry that day. Angry they were using kids as photo ops. Angry that the city remembered the headlines, but not the people. But he remembered Devin now. He remembered the boy trailing after him all afternoon, quiet but curious. Nate had given him a book, a tattered copy of The Phantom Toll Booth, before he left. He hadn't thought about that in years. Now it felt like a memory grabbing him by the collar. The next morning, Nate stepped into his office building not in a suit, but in jeans and a hoodie. Sam had driven him to the Eastwood Records Annex before sunrise. The city archive office smelled like mildew and cardboard, but the clerk on duty recognized his name instantly and gave him access without hesitation. He spent 4 hours combing through juvenile records, digging for anything that mentioned Devin Brooks. Every page told a story of someone slipping through the cracks. Truancy reports, a short stint in juvenile detention, warnings from social workers, then silence. A final note said Devin had aged out of the system at 19 and disappeared off the grid 2 years later. Nate stared at that last page for a long time. Sam waited in the car outside, sipping coffee. "Well?" he asked as Nate climbed back in. "It was me," Nate said softly. Sam didn't push for more. They drove to Garden Hollow again, this time with groceries in the back seat and a bag of tools Nate had dug out of his storage unit. The house looked even smaller in daylight. Natalie opened the door before he knocked, her eyes lighting up for the briefest second before she folded her arms and stepped aside. "Grandma's sleeping," she said. and the hot water's still broken. I brought tools, Nate replied. She nodded as if she expected nothing less. He worked in the kitchen for a while, tightening pipes and replacing the filter under the sink. Natalie hovered nearby, watching every move like she was memorizing it. You used to fix things as a kid? She asked. I used to break things, he said. Fixing came later. She grinned. When Grace finally stirred from her nap, she insisted on making tea, waving off Nate's protests. He sat in the living room with Natalie while Grace worked in the kitchen, the soft clinking of porcelain filling the silence. Do you think my dad's still out there? Natalie asked suddenly. Nate glanced at her. You want the truth? She nodded. I don't know, he said. But if he is, I think he's trying to forget who he used to be. Natalie's jaw tightened. He promised he wouldn't leave again. I know. She looked up at him, eyes shining. You think people can stop being who they are? He thought for a long time before answering. No, he said, but I think people can decide who they want to become. The hard part is not running when it gets uncomfortable. Sophia was unhappy when he died. No, Dare replied. No. Natalie turned that over in her head. Grace returned with tea, settling into her chair with a soft groan. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the cups down. Nate leaned forward. Grace, if I wanted to help more than just fixing leaky pipes, what would that look like? She studied him carefully. What are you offering? I don't want Natalie to end up like me, or like Devon. You think it's that simple? Grace asked. You can just walk in here with tools and groceries and change the course of someone's life? No, Nate said, but I can start with not leaving. She sat back, lips pressed tight, then nodded once. Then you'd better come back tomorrow, she said. The hallway light's been out since spring. That night, Nate stood in his high-rise apartment, staring down at the city. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. You're still a week out from your keynote address. Want me to prep your remarks about Eastwood? He didn't reply. Instead, he turned off the lights and stood in the dark, letting the city talk to itself. He returned to Garden Hollow the next morning, and the next. Each day he fixed something small. A hinge, a doorframe, the radiator in the back bedroom. Each time Natalie watched, not with the wide-eyed awe of a child watching a hero, but with the cautious trust of someone waiting to be proven right. One afternoon, as he was repairing a cracked windowsill, Natalie came and sat beside him, legs swinging. You think it's weird? She asked. What makes it? You're here, that I found you. He glanced at her. You think it's weird? She shrugged. I think it's something. He smiled. I think so too. Sam had started parking around the corner out of sight, leaving Nate to walk the last few steps alone. It felt right, like a slow shedding of the old version of himself. On the 5th day, Grace called him into the kitchen. You'll need to hear this, she said. An envelope lay on the table, no return address. Inside was a photo. Even older, thinner, hollowed out. There was a note scribbled on the back in shaky handwriting. Tell her I'm sorry. I'm not coming back. I don't deserve her. Nate held the photo tight in his hand. Grace didn't cry. She just reached for the kettle. Natalie didn't say much when he showed her. She stared at the picture, her face unreadable, then folded the paper and slid it into her backpack. Do you hate him? She asked. No, Nate said quietly. I just wish he'd believed he could change. Natalie nodded. She didn't cry either. Later that evening, Nate sat on the porch alone, listening to the soft murmur of the city, the creak of wood beneath him, the flickering hum of the streetlight overhead. He looked at the house, still crooked, still fragile, but somehow stronger. Natalie stepped outside and sat beside him. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They just sat, a girl and a man who had once been a boy just like her. And for the first time in years, Nate didn't feel like he was just passing through. He felt rooted. Nate sat across from the school principal, his fingers laced tightly in front of him on the desk. The walls around them were plastered with inspirational posters, smiling cartoon pencils and dancing multiplication tables, but none of them softened the look in the principal's eyes. "She's been getting into fights," Mrs. Phelps said plainly. "Not just arguments, fights, physical ones." Nate's jaw tightened. "Why wasn't I told sooner?" "You're not on the official contact list. Her grandmother handles all school communications. Until yesterday, we didn't even know your connection." He leaned back, trying to keep his voice level. "What happened?" Mrs. Phelps pulled a paper from her folder. "Another student made comments about her parents. Natalie hit him, then shoved another girl who laughed." He didn't need the full transcript. He knew exactly how it went. A cruel word, a cheap laugh, and that slow boil that bubbles too hot for a kid to hold in. "Is she suspended?" Mrs. Phelps hesitated. "1 day, in school. It's policy." "But, Nate—" "Can I be honest?" He nodded. "She's not angry the way some kids are. She's carrying something too heavy for her age. She doesn't talk about her mother. She doesn't even say her father's name. But every time someone gets too close to those subjects, it's like she flips a switch." Nate rubbed his face. "I know. I've seen this before," Mrs. Phelps added. "They act tough because no one's ever been soft with them long enough to make it safe." That hit deeper than he wanted to admit. After the meeting, he waited on the bench outside the office until Natalie appeared. She held her backpack in one hand and a small slip of paper in the other. She didn't look embarrassed, just tired. He didn't speak right away. They walked together in silence until they reached the car. Sam opened the door without a word, and Natalie climbed in. Back in the car, Nate turned to her. "You want to tell me what happened?" "No." He looked at her. "I'm not here to yell." "Doesn't matter," she mumbled. "Everyone yells eventually." "I don't," he said softly. She folded her arms, face hard. "They were talking about my mom. Said she died 'cause she was stupid. Said she didn't love me enough to stay alive." Nate clenched his fists. "They said that to you?" She nodded. "And the teacher?" "Didn't hear it." He nodded slowly. "Then I'm glad you hit them." Her eyes widened, blinking back surprise. "I'm not saying it was the best way," he added. "But I get it. Some things can't go unanswered." Natalie looked down at her shoes, still clean, still tied tight. "They said I'm like my dad, that I'm going to run away too." "You think that's true?" She hesitated. "Sometimes." Nate reached across the seat and gently tapped the edge of her comic book, poking out of the bag. "Storm ever run away?" "No." "Why not?" "She didn't have to." "Exactly," he said. "You don't either." That night, Nate stayed for dinner. Grace had made boxed mac and cheese and microwaved some leftover greens. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm. Real. Natalie ate with one hand and read with the other. When the dishes were done, Nate stepped outside onto the porch while Grace rested in her chair. The porch still creaked, the same loose board near the steps threatening to trip anyone not paying attention. He crouched down with a wrench and set to work, tightening it. "Trying to fix everything at once?" Grace asked from behind him. "Trying not to keep walking past it," he said. She grunted, amused. "That's new for you." He looked over his shoulder. "You say that like you know me." "I know your type," she said. "The runners, the fixers. Always think you can patch up other people because you never figured out how to patch yourselves." Nate sighed. "You're not wrong. You care about her." He didn't answer. "You're not her father," she added gently. "No," he said. "But maybe I'm what her father needed before he gave up." Grace didn't reply, but her silence felt less like judgment and more like agreement. 2 days later, he took Natalie to the park. Just the two of them, not the playground part, but the section near the pond where geese waddled through the grass and old men played chess with plastic timers and milk crates. She brought her comic book, of course, but this time she didn't read it. "Did you ever get in fights?" she asked him. Nate chuckled. "More than I should have. Less than I wanted to. I might. Because I hated being invisible," he said. "And when people notice you, they stop walking past." She nodded like she understood that far too well for her age. "You know what else I did?" he asked. "What? Is to draw blueprints. Of buildings?" "Yeah. Of homes. But not like the ones I was stuck in. Big ones. Safe ones. Where the rooms didn't lock from the outside." She looked at him. "Did you ever build one?" "Not yet," he said, "but I think I'm getting close." Later that week, Grace handed him an envelope. It was Natalie's school paperwork. Emergency contact forms, guardianship waivers, medical authorizations. "I'm not dying," she said, "but I'm tired, and if this thing goes sideways, she deserves someone steady." Nate stared at the forms. "You sure?" "She trusts you," Grace replied. "That's more than I can say about anyone else these past few years." He signed the papers without hesitation. The next time Natalie got into an argument at school, the office called him directly. This time, she hadn't thrown a punch. She'd just walked away before it got there. When he picked her up, she climbed into the car and said, "I didn't hit them." He smiled. "Progress. You're still staying, right?" she asked. "Still here," he said. "You'll stay even if I mess up again." "Especially then." She turned toward the window, quiet, but her shoulders dropped just a little, like she'd finally exhaled. At night, after she'd fallen asleep on the couch, Nate sat at the kitchen table across from Grace. The faucet no longer dripped. The heater hummed quietly. The house, still crooked, felt warmer than his high-rise had ever been. "She's starting to believe it," Grace said. "What's that?" "Thing that people can change, that they don't always leave." Nate stared at Natalie's backpack, resting on the floor beside the couch, one strap half unzipped, her comic book stuck out slightly, dog-eared and worn, but still holding together. "I want to build something here," he said. Grace raised an eyebrow. "Like a house?" "Like a future," he said. "For her. For this block. For every kid that thinks this city doesn't see them." Grace leaned back. "Then you'd better get started. Time's always running." He nodded. This time, he wouldn't run with it. The smell of sawdust drifted through the spring air as the first hammer struck wood. Natalie stood at the edge of the empty lot, arms crossed, her curls tied back in a ponytail, the morning sun warming her face. The crooked house was still there, its porch now reinforced, new railings gleaming under a fresh coat of paint. But it wasn't the focus anymore. Today, everyone was gathered across the street, watching something grow from nothing. The community build had started just after Easter. Nate hadn't announced it in a press release or held a ribbon-cutting ceremony. No gold shovels, no suits. He'd just shown up one day with a clipboard and a roll of blueprints under his arm, and within a week, volunteers from the neighborhood began trickling in. He called it the Haven, a 3-story building with 6 family units, one communal garden, a tutoring center on the first floor, and a roof where kids could see the skyline and remember they belonged in it. It wasn't some luxury condo or investment property. It was what he used to dream about as a boy when the ceilings leaked and the locks only worked from the outside. Natalie stepped beside him now, holding 2 bottles of water. He took one, smiling down at her. "You excited?" She nodded. "You really gonna let me paint a wall?" "I promised, didn't I?" She grinned. "Good. I've already picked the color." He winced. "Should I be worried?" "It's purple." That's not a warning, that's a threat. She laughed, a full laugh that filled the air in a way he hadn't heard from her before. It was bright, unapologetic, alive. Grace sat nearby on a folding chair under an umbrella, a paper fan swaying in her hand, a knowing smirk on her face. Her health had gotten better since the heaters were fixed, and the meds were no longer rationed. She still walked slow and used her cane like it was part of her spine, but the light had returned to her voice. A few neighbors stopped to say hello, some dropping off trays of food, others offering tools or extra paint. It had started with one little girl's question, "Can I go along with you?" Now it was a whole neighborhood going with him. Later that afternoon, Nate took Natalie to a park on the north end of the city, one she'd never seen before. Bigger trees, wider paths. She rode her bike, a brand new red one he'd given her 2 weeks ago after she passed her math test, with a perfect score. She wore the helmet like a badge of honor and pointed out every squirrel, duck, and dog they passed. "Can I bring my friends here sometime?" she asked. "Of course." "And Grace?" "She'll need convincing, but yes." Natalie stopped near the fountain and looked up at him, her eyes steady. "Are you ever going to leave?" He didn't answer right away. She watched him closely, waiting. Not with fear this time, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to tell the difference between promises and plans. "No," he said, "not anymore." She gave a small nod and turned back toward her bike. Back at Garden Hollow that evening, the porch light flickered on as the sun dipped below the horizon. Nate sat on the steps with a clipboard, scribbling notes, cost estimates, wiring routes, measurements for custom window frames. Natalie lay on the grass nearby, sketching new superhero designs in a notepad, one of them suspiciously resembling a tall man with a hammer, a gray hoodie, and a grumpy smile. "I'm going to write a comic," she said, "about a guy who used to build buildings for money, but then he started building them for kids." Nate glanced up. "Sounds familiar." "Haha," she said. "Only difference is, he can fly." He laughed. "Well, you got the imagination. Now all you need is someone to believe in you." "I got that," she said quietly. The sound of footsteps made them look up. A woman stood near the gate, holding a stack of books and a clipboard. She wore a volunteer badge and a lanyard from the City Youth Center. "You Nate Walker?" she asked. "I'm the new after-school coordinator. Heard you're offering up space in the new building." He nodded. "We'll have room for your whole program." She looked at Natalie. "She yours?" Nate paused, looked at her. Natalie met his eyes, her smile small but sure. "Yeah," he said finally. "She is." The woman smiled and left her number. Nate watched her go, then turned back to Natalie. "You okay with that?" She shrugged. "Took you long enough." Grace laughed from inside the house, the screen door creaking open. "You boys finished planning the whole city yet?" "Just about," Nate called back. Natalie stood, brushing grass off her jeans. "Want to see the comic cover?" He nodded and she held up the page. There, drawn in bold lines and scribbled crayon, was a superhero standing between two tall buildings. He wasn't wearing a cape, just jeans and work boots. Behind him, a little girl stood holding a comic of her own. The title above them read, "The Man Who Stayed." Nate's throat tightened. "I love it," he said. Natalie beamed. "It's a series." "Of course it is." That night, as the lights dimmed in the house and Grace went to bed, Nate stood in the kitchen, one hand on the window frame. He watched Natalie as she slept on the couch, comic pages splayed across her chest, the new story already halfway finished. She looked peaceful, safe, and he finally understood something he hadn't before, not when he made his first million, not when he opened his first shelter, not even when he saw himself in a photo he hadn't remembered taking. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about showing up, again and again and again, because staying isn't a one-time promise. It's a choice you make every single day. And for the first time in his life, he was choosing it. For her, for himself, and for every kid who ever sat on a step and waited for someone to care. Nate turned out the light and sat beside her, close enough to hear her breathing. He stayed there all night. And in the morning,